It is my unique privilege to introduce the founder of Free Thought Blogs, writer of Dispatches from the Culture Wars. He's been on the Rachel Maddow show, for which I envy him to no degree. But my personal friend and one of the most unbiased, clear thinkers and writers in all of the atheist movement, please give a warm, godless round of applause for Mr. Ed Brayton.
Thanks very much. Great pleasure to be here, and pardon me, I have a dry mouth. Always a pleasure to be anywhere JT is. A couple of years ago in Virginia, a woman filed a lawsuit against the local county board of commissioners because they were opening all their meetings with Christian prayers. Her attorneys filed a brief in the case asking that she be allowed to file anonymously as Jane Doe. And in many other cases, plaintiffs have been allowed to do so, more often when it involves like a child or student in school than with an adult. The Board of Supervisors in her county is being represented by a group called Liberty Counsel, which is Jerry Falwell's legal wing with Liberty University. Now, despite the fact that her attorneys had many hateful and angry phone calls and emails they could show to the judge, emails that were aimed at the attorneys because they were the only ones whose names were public at the time. The plaintiff's name had not been revealed. Liberty Counsel argued very strongly against anonymity in this case. And the judge ultimately said no, that the plaintiff had to reveal her name, and she faced a very difficult choice. Did she reveal her name and go public with it and risk the almost inevitable retaliation that comes from local communities in this case, or does she withdraw the case? In her case, she decided to go public with it. That happens probably one at every 3 or 4 times. Quite often, if anonymity is denied, the plaintiffs will withdraw from the case rather than face the backlash from their local community. And so in this talk and in an upcoming book that I'm writing on the same subject, I want to go into some of the history of this kind of abuse of plaintiffs in these church-state cases who challenge the right of Christians to have exclusive domain over our politics and our culture. And I'm going to show you why plaintiffs in these cases should be granted anonymity almost automatically. Of course, there are a few kinds of legal battles that provoke a stronger emotional reaction than lawsuits that challenge the many ways that Christianity is the dominant cultural assumption in America. Prayer in schools, creationism in schools, monuments on courthouse lawns, 10 Commandments monuments, nativity displays, that sort of thing. The plaintiffs in these cases are almost always met with a furious backlash from members of the community in which those battles take place. The plaintiff is almost always a very tiny minority, sometimes the only person in their community who's willing to stand up against this sort of thing, and that really puts them at enormous risk. And the remarkable thing in my research for the book is that when you look at the history of these lawsuits, the patterns are remarkably consistent, and it doesn't matter what part of the country you're in. You might think that it'd be worse maybe in the Deep South. It's not. Some of these cases have taken place in, well, one of them we're going to talk about took place in Rhode Island, which is founded by the man who coined the phrase separation of church and state. It doesn't matter when you're looking at, and I'm going to go in the book back all the way to the 1930s with cases like this, and all the way up to the present day. You get the same exact reaction. Those who challenge Christian privilege are ostracized, bullied, harassed, often also the victims of vandalism, almost always death threats, and sometimes very serious violence. Children are assaulted, sometimes their parents are too. Homes are burned down, families are chased out of town by the proverbial mob with pitchforks and torches. Before I get to some of the stories of those plaintiffs, I want to give a little history and some background on the legal battles that they fought. Of course, the question of the relationship between church and state was considered such an important one by the men who framed the Constitution that those who wrote the Bill of Rights began the very first amendment by addressing them. And of course, the first clauses of the First Amendment say, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free practice thereof. These are known as the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Like most of the provisions of the Bill of Rights, these operate as restrictions on government action. The government may not establish a religion, nor may it prevent someone from practicing their religion within some fairly narrow exceptions, of course. And though the text says explicitly that Congress shall make no law, those restrictions now apply to state and local governments as well. They were incorporated, and that's a legal term of art, by the 14th Amendment, which applies the Bill of Rights to state and local governments, as well as the federal government. Now, the Supreme Court first applied the Establishment Clause to state and local action in 1947 in a case called Everson versus Board of Education, which involved the use of public funds to transport kids to private Catholic schools in the state of New Jersey. State law allowed school districts to reimburse parents for the cost of getting to and from school, including religious schools. And the Supreme Court said for the first time that the Establishment Clause applies to states as well as to the federal government. The majority opinion in this case was written by a man named Justice Hugo Black, who was one of my favorite justices of all time. Very fascinating man. As a young man, was actually a member of the KKK. Ended up on the Supreme Court, much later. Ended up being on the right side of some very important civil rights battles. And in that ruling, he laid out the broad meaning of the Establishment Clause. He wrote, quote, "The Establishment of Religion Clause of the First Amendment means at least this. Neither a state nor the federal government can set up a church. Neither can pass laws which aid one religion, aid all religions, or prefer one religion over another. Neither can force nor influence a person to go to or remain away from church against his will, or force him to profess a belief or disbelief in any religion. No person can be punished for entertaining or professing religious beliefs or disbeliefs, for church attendance or non-attendance. No tax in any amount, large or small, can be levied to support any religious activities or institutions, whatever they may be called or whatever form they may adopt to teach or practice religion. Neither a state nor the federal government can, openly or secretly, participate in the affairs of any religious organizations or groups, and vice versa. In the words of Jefferson, the clause against establishment of religion by law was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state." But here's a surprising thing about that case. Even though Justice Black said no tax may be levied for the support of religious institutions, large or small, the Supreme Court actually upheld this law and said that it was okay to use tax dollars to transport kids to private Christian schools. And it said it did not violate that clause because the reimbursement was offered across the board to all parents, regardless of where you sent your child. But while that particular practice was upheld, the application of the Establishment Clause to state and local governments would lead to a number of important cases that declared a whole range of policies that clearly established Christian privilege to be unconstitutional. In 1962, a case called Engel versus Vitale, the court ruled that a school could not begin the day by having students recite a government-composed prayer, even if they allowed kids to opt out of having to say them. That decision also written by Justice Hugo Black, by the way. The year after that, 1963, the court ruled in a case called Abington Township versus Shem that the school could not force students to read the Bible. Now, some of you probably know my friend Ellery Shem, who was writing the foreword to my book, for which I'm very grateful. He was a student in the case who, when it came to be his turn to get up and read the Bible, sat at his desk and read the Quran instead, which took some guts in 1958, I think this happened. And Ellery is now a retired physicist and still very, very active in battles over church and state. Now, of course, the religious and political establishment did not take these rulings lying down. They were quite upset. Many attempts were made to amend the Constitution to allow forced prayer and Bible reading in public schools. Over the next few years, more than 150 resolutions were passed in Congress supporting an amendment that would do exactly that, an amendment to the Constitution. To this day, of course, you can still hear the religious right complaining about how they took God out of schools and won't let kids pray in school. But it seems to me that if forcing school children to recite government-composed prayers or read a religion's holy book is not a violation of the First Amendment, it's almost hard to imagine what could possibly be. In 1971, the court ruled in a case called Lemon versus Kurtzman that a state cannot use tax dollars to help pay the salaries of teachers in private religious schools. And that case is famous for the test that it established to determine whether there was an Establishment Clause violation, known as the Lemon Test. It's a three-pronged test. In order to be constitutional, a law must first have a secular purpose. It must not have the primary effect of either advancing or inhibiting religion, and it must not result in an excessive entanglement, government entanglement with religion. These are frequently referred to as the purpose prong, the effect prong, and the excessive entanglement prong. Since 1971, the Supreme Court has used the Lemon Test to determine when the government has violated the Establishment Clause, but only sometimes. Sometimes they use one of a number of other standards, which has become a real problem for state and local governments in trying to figure out what they can and can't do. And a problem for lower court judges trying to follow the Supreme Court precedents on the subject. In working on my book, I have a good friend, Dan Ray, who teaches constitutional law. And I asked him to give me a quote for the book about this sort of incoherent jurisprudence that the Supreme Court has put together on this. He called those rulings, quote, a messy tangle of rules and standards that are among the most incoherent of the constitutional canon. And he said, quote, this really is a mess of the court's own making, resulting as it has from the court's thinly veiled desire to force the round peg of religion into the public square. For their part, the justices need not concern themselves with it too much, but for the rest of us, who are forced to try and make some sense of it to run schools, businesses, governments, and our daily lives, it's like a never-ending game of constitutional whack-a-mole. In short, they've made a hell of a mess out of this issue. I'm guessing Dan would agree with me on this, right? To give you an example of just how absurd the court's rulings on this can be, in 2005, on the very same day, the Supreme Court handed down 2 rulings involving 10 Commandments displays on public property, one in Kentucky, one in Texas. On the same day, they declared that the one in Kentucky was unconstitutional and had to be taken down, and they declared that the one in Texas was constitutional and could be left up. It's a little confusing as to what they're doing here. Now, sometimes the court uses something called the Endorsement Test, which was proposed by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor in a 1985 case called Lynch versus Donnelly, which involved a nativity scene on courthouse grounds. And O'Connor argued that the key question in such cases was whether the government's actions could be viewed by a reasonable observer as being a government endorsement of a particular religion. And she said that the problem with such endorsements is that they, quote, send a message to non-adherents that they are outsiders, not full members of the political community, and an accompanying message to adherents that they are insiders, favored members of the political community. Now, as we'll see shortly, that is precisely what government endorsements do, and I argue exactly what they are intended to do. The history of abuse aimed at plaintiffs who file suits over Establishment Clause violations proves Justice O'Connor's concerns about endorsements to be true. That abuse clearly establishes the non-religious, and even those who are religious but who object to government misusing its authority to proselytize their children, as second-class citizens. What is it we hear the most from people about these cases? Well, this is a Christian country, and if you don't like it, why don't you leave? Pretty clearly makes us outsiders, I think. Now, all of these government policies, from prayer and Bible reading in schools to the exclusive display of Christian symbols on public property, to a dozen other things, combine to form what I call Christian privilege. The formal and informal system of legal, political, and cultural domination and privilege that Christians often believe to be their birthright in this country. And those who challenge that privilege, especially with church-state lawsuits, can expect a serious and immediate backlash. In my book, I'm going to examine many of these cases, but I want to look at 2 of them in particular. And the first of them, I'm sure most of you are aware of, is Jessica Ahlquist. Probably some of you recognize the shirt that I'm wearing as a reference to that, which I'll get to in a minute. Jessica is a very courageous young lady from Cranston, Rhode Island, who filed a successful lawsuit to get a prayer mural removed from the auditorium of her high school. What you may not know is that she was not the first person to challenge this mural. In her freshman year in high school, a parent in the community actually came forward and tried to challenge it with the school board. That parent called the ACLU, which sent a letter to the board requesting that it be taken down. The school board meetings quickly became sort of verbal war zones as people lined up to defend the mural. Jessica got up at one of these meetings and spoke in favor of taking the mural down. And when she mentioned that she was an atheist, there were literally gasps from the audience. They were so shocked at the idea that anyone would be an atheist. And one woman sitting in front, a little under her breath, but so that everyone can hear her, called her a little witch. The school board decided to form a committee to make a decision on what to do about the mural, and they decided after a few months not to take it down. It was then that Jessica decided to file a lawsuit with the help of the ACLU. A lawsuit was filed in April of 2011 on a Monday. The next morning, sitting in homeroom, where they recite the Pledge of Allegiance every morning, including the under God part, when they got to the point in the pledge where it says, "One nation under God," the other students in her class all turned to her and screamed it at her. Jessica was 15 years old at the time. And with every passing day, the mistreatment got worse and worse, and school became an absolutely miserable experience for her. At one point, the mayor of Cranston, a man named Alan Fung, came to speak to a school assembly for, ironically, Diversity Day. And he talked about being a Chinese American and having to overcome discrimination. And when the students had a chance to ask him questions, one of them asked what he thought of the lawsuit over the mural. They were in the school auditorium where the mural was literally on the wall at the time. And the mayor pointed to the mural and said that he hoped the mural stayed right where it was because he didn't think it was hurting anyone. The entire student body stood up and started clapping and cheering wildly as she sort of sunk down in her feet, feeling as though she'd been slapped in the face. The students turned and started yelling at her and pointing fingers, and she ended up running out of the auditorium and into the bathroom. Imagine for a moment being 15 years old and having your entire school virtually hate you. It takes tremendous courage, I think, to do what she did. Another local politician went even further, attacking Jessica by name. The day after the ruling came down, which was January 2012, there's a man named Peter Palumbo. He was the state representative for Cranston. He was a graduate of Cranston West High School himself. And he went on a local radio show and called Jessica an evil little thing, and thus the evil big thing. I didn't think I could pull off little. So I had this one made up. And he said that taking down the pure prayer mural was like crucifying Jesus all over again. Very rational man, this Peter Palumbo. And he said he was tired of Christians just laying down when they're challenged on things like this. And he and the host went on and on about how Jessica was now going to file $1 million lawsuit against the city. This was all about money. Of course, that never happened. But these two grown men had no trouble luridly speculating about and calling this then 16-year-old girl a gold digger with no evidence whatsoever. And this man was her representative in the state legislature. So she won the lawsuit in January of 2012, and it was a very predictable decision. The school had no legal leg to stand on. They actually tried to argue that the mural wasn't religious, even though it began with Our Heavenly Father and ended with Amen. They tried to argue that this was not religious at all. But when she won the lawsuit, when she actually managed to diminish the Christian privilege in her school, things got immeasurably worse. The response was a torrent of hatred and some of the most vile threats imaginable. Of course, in the old days, when people wanted to do this, you had to actually put pen to paper if you wanted to send a death threat. Now we have Twitter and we have Facebook, and it's much easier to do this sort of thing, and she just was buried under this. I want to read some of the tweets that were aimed at Jessica in the days following. One young man said, quote, "I raped an atheist," and followed up with, "Hail Mary, full of grace, Jessica Ahlquist is going to get punched in the face." Another one unleashed a string of abuse. The first one said, "Hey guys, I fucking hate atheists too." And then he turned up the charm and said, "When I take over the world, I'm going to do a Holocaust on all the atheists." The threats became very specific. Some of them came from her classmates at Cranston West High School. One said, "What a little bitch, I want to snuff her." Another said, "If I wasn't 18 and wouldn't go to jail for it, I'd beat the shit out of her. I don't know how she got away with not getting beat up yet." Another one said, "This girl honestly needs to be punched in the face." One of her classmates said, "You brainless little idiot, I hope you will be punished. You have not won shit, you stupid little brainless skunk." One of her classmates said, "Jess is in my bio class. She's going to get some shit thrown at her. But for real, somebody should jump this girl. Let's do it." Another classmate said, "I want to punch this girl in the face." Then there was a woman named Rachel Knight who said, "I hope there's a lot of banners in hell when you're rotting there, you atheist fuck." Very charming. Especially charming on that one was that the hashtag she used was pound Team Jesus. Because you could just feel the love, you know. I don't remember a line of the Beatitudes that said, "Blessed are the abusive, hateful assholes, for they shall get many followers on Twitter." But this one is my favorite just because it's so incoherent. Someone tweeted to her, "For the record, when you die, you will not grow into a tree or some other bullshit atheists believe in." I guess he told us. We can be pretty sure that he's not going to be taking a Rhodes Scholarship away from a more deserving candidate. There were hundreds of messages like this on Twitter and Facebook, but some of the people were going old school and sending their threats through snail mail. This is one letter that was sent to her house, threatening not only Jessica, but even her little sister and the rest of her family. It said, quote, "The cops will not watch you forever. We will get you good. Tell your little asshole sister to watch her back. There are many of us crusaders. We have a betting pool going to see who gets you first. Your fucking old man better move or keep you locked up if you know what's good for you. We know where he works, what kind of cars you have, and the plate numbers of the cars. Get the fuck out of Rhode Island, you bitchin' whore. You are nothing more than a sex toy of a slut." I have no idea what that has to do with anything. "Maybe you will be gangbanged before we throw you out of one of our cars. We will get you. Look out." Things got so bad that she ended up having to go to school with an armed police guard to keep her safe. And if you happen to have an irony meter with you today, I suggest you turn it off, because they don't make them strong enough to withstand the blow I'm about to deliver. I want to read to you what that mural said. It said, "Our Heavenly Father, grant us each day the desire to do our best, to grow mentally and morally as well as physically, to be kind and helpful to our classmates and teachers, to be honest with ourselves as well as with others. Help us to be good sports and smile when we lose as well as when we win. Teach us the value of true friendship and help us to conduct ourselves so as to bring credit to Cranston High School West. Amen." I'm reminded of a joke that Jon Stewart did, where he said, if you think that putting up the 10 Commandments in schools is going to help kids behave better, then you probably also think that putting up that employees must wash hands sign in the bathroom of the restaurant is keeping the urine out of your cheeseburger. It's painfully obvious that having that sign there did nothing to actually inculcate those values into the very students who were so enraged at the thought of taking it down. Now, as bad as the situation was with Jessica Ahlquist, it's not the worst I've heard of, not by a long shot. Maybe the single worst case I've seen was the case of a woman named Joanne Bell, who filed a suit against the school system in Little Axe, Oklahoma in 1981. In the fall of 1980, her children started talking about something called the Sunshine Club, sun spelled S-O-N. This was a Christian group that met every Thursday before school started in the junior high. The club was started by a teacher who said that Jesus had appeared to her in a vision and commanded her to save all the children of Little Axe. Now, Little Axe is about 2 hours away from Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is where Oral Roberts famously saw the 900-foot Jesus floating above the city. We don't know whether the teacher saw the 900-foot version or just the normal version, but there were a lot of problems going on here. First of all, the teachers in the school were constantly encouraging the kids to attend the meetings and would actually question students who didn't attend, asking them why they weren't there. Secondly, the school buses picked kids up much earlier than they needed to on Thursdays so that the kids who wanted to attend the Sunshine Club meeting could be there. But all the kids who didn't want to go to the Sunshine Club meeting weren't allowed in the school. They had to sit outside for the 45 minutes of this meeting and the schools had to run, or the buses had to run only once. Those who didn't attend were aggressively pressured by their classmates and told that if they didn't attend, they must be devil worshippers. So Joanne Bell began attending school board meetings along with a handful of other parents to ask questions about this program, but the school board supported the club completely and ignored their complaints. In the spring of 1981, the school board president actually told Joanne Bell, "We're not going to change this, and if you don't like it, call the ACLU." She did. Along with another parent named Lucille McCord, they launched a 7-year legal battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court and ended with a victory for the plaintiffs. Now, the school board in this case was represented by a man named Bill Graves, who was a state legislator and a lawyer who had written the law in Oklahoma allowing prayer in schools. You may recognize this name. He was in the news again 2 or 3 weeks ago. Did you guys see the story about a judge in Oklahoma who had denied a transgender woman the right to change her name and then got overturned by the state appeals court? The judge was Bill Graves. Same one. And during the initial trial, one of the expert witnesses he called to testify was a man named Rusus John Rushdoony, or R.J. Rushdoony. How many people, by show of hands, know who Rushdoony is? or was. He's dead now. R.J. Rushdoony is the godfather of Christian Reconstructionism, which teaches that the whole Bible, the Old Testament Mosaic law, should be the civil and criminal law of the land, and that Christian theocracy is the only legitimate form of government. Bill Graves is also a Reconstructionist. And though they both argue that there was nothing wrong with the school teaching Christianity, one of the principles of Reconstructionism is that public education is an evil thing and should be abolished. The law that they want to institute includes stoning to death for adulterers, unruly children, blasphemers, witches, those who use the Lord's name in vain, women who aren't virgins on their wedding day. Very, very charming. There's a man named Gary North, who is Rushdoony's son-in-law and now the most prominent leader of the Christian Reconstructionists. By the way, he is also the curriculum director for the Ron Paul curriculum. He used to be Ron Paul's chief of staff in the 70s. Gary North wrote an article defending stoning, in which he argued that one of the great benefits of using stoning as a punishment was that it was so cheap. There are rocks just laying around on the ground everywhere. Gary North also said this, and when I first found this quote, I doubted it. It's such a perfect quote for using against them that I thought, this can't be real. Anybody who's on Facebook, you know the memes that you see constantly, and most of them are complete bullshit. So I went and looked this up and found the book that he had written. This is an actual quote. He said, "So let us be blunt about it. We must use the doctrine of religious liberty to gain independence for Christian schools until we train up a generation of people who know that there is no religious neutrality, no neutral law, no neutral education, and no neutral government. Then they will get busy in constructing a Bible-based social, political, and religious order which finally denies the religious liberty of the enemies of God." So while all this was going on in the courts, the community and the school system was treating the Bell and McCord families exactly like North and Rushdoony would want them to be treated. The suit was filed in May of 1981, just before the end of the school year, about 3 weeks before the end of the school year. Joanne Bell's son was set to receive 7 of the 9 end-of-year academic awards from the junior high school. And for the first time ever, they canceled the award ceremony so they wouldn't have to hand him these awards, and they just put them in the mail. A couple weeks after the lawsuit was filed, and this is where it really gets horrifying, someone calls in a bomb threat to the school. And she gets a phone call, like any parent would do, jumps in the car, heads down to the school, find out, make sure her kids are safe. She pulled up into the school parking lot, started to get out of her car, and a school employee by the name of Corinne Spurlock grabbed her by the hair, pulled her out of the car, smashed her head up against the roof of the car several times. All of this time, the elementary school principal was standing about 15 feet away watching this and doing nothing. After a few minutes of watching this woman get beaten, the principal said, "She's had enough. Let her go." Spurlock pleaded guilty to assault. She ended up with, Joanne Bell ended up with a concussion, a sprained shoulder, about half the hair on her head, side of her head ripped out. Spurlock pleaded guilty to assault but was not given a jail sentence. She was given a fine. Not only did the school not fire her, they held a fundraiser to pay her fine. And then things just get worse. Her kids were called communists. They were physically threatened. Parents refused to let their kids be friends with the children of the plaintiffs. Lucille McCord's son had an upside-down cross hung on his locker. One of the things in this, and this is one of the things I found in a whole bunch of these cases, is animal abuse. The McCord family raised prize lambs for the county fair, and someone slaughtered one of their lambs. I find that rather ironic, that people who follow someone that they refer to as the Lamb of God would slaughter a lamb for this. Things weren't any better for the Bell family. Jason, who was in 5th grade at the time, probably got the worst of it. One day during morning recess, someone pushed him off the swings and he broke his arm. The principal of the school, the same one who had watched Joanne Bell get beaten by a school employee without doing anything about it, took Jason into his office and made him sit there all day. He didn't call Joanne Bell. He didn't call the hospital. He didn't get the kid treated. When she went to pick him up from school, she found out that several hours earlier this had happened. and nobody had been called. She took him to the hospital. He had a compound fracture of his arm and underwent emergency surgery. The threats kept pouring in. Every time the phone would ring, they would panic. They received threatening letters telling them, "We have ways of getting rid of people like you." Many of those letters threatened to burn down their house. Both Joanne Bell, and I find this really creepy, both Joanne Bell and Lucille McCord received their own obituaries in the mail. For some reason, that just really creeps me out. Now, on September 19th of that year, Joanne Bell's obituary nearly came true. The Bell family had gone to a football game in a neighboring town that their son, who was then in the 9th grade, was playing in. And when they arrived at the game, they were met by a police officer who told them, "You better go home, your house is on fire." Someone had thrown a firebomb through a bedroom window, and by the time they got home, it was gone. It was ashes. A few days after the house burned down, in an extraordinary display of chutzpah, the following Monday, Bill Graves, representing the school board, filed a motion with the court saying you should dismiss the case because they no longer live in the school district and they don't have standing. The judge said no. He said, "I'm not going to allow vigilante justice to decide the outcome of this case." But I think this illustrates exactly what this kind of violence is intended to do. It is meant to intimidate. It is meant to make people cower in silence so they won't face the same treatment, and it works. In that very case, there were originally 4 sets of parents who were plaintiffs in the case. 2 of them dropped out. One of them was a woman named Carly McGuire. She was one of the first plaintiffs in the case. She dropped out after her phone rang one day and she picked it up. And there was a little girl's voice on the other end of the phone. And it said, "Mommy?" And she pretty quickly recognized it wasn't her daughter's voice. And then it was replaced by an adult voice saying, "Next time it'll be your daughter." And the next day she dropped out of the case. And who can blame her? Now, the trial itself was fascinating, especially the witnesses called by the school in their defense. One witness said that if we didn't teach Christianity in schools, the nation would descend into fascism. They called a man named Dr. Paul Schmidt, who was a Christian psychologist, who said that the things taught in church were losing their power because they weren't being reinforced by the schools. And he said that unless the court allowed the schools to teach kids to be Christian, quote, God could be seen as omnipotent, an irrelevant figure. He doesn't have the power to come to school, which doesn't sound like a very omnipotent God to me. Now, remember earlier when I talked about the Lemon test? That was the standard being used in this case. So the school had to show that the policy that allowed these meetings to take place had a secular purpose and did not have the effect of advancing religion, which is a pretty difficult thing to prove when your own witnesses are talking about the importance of teaching Christianity in school. In 2005, you guys probably remember the Dover trial, the big intelligent design trial in Dover, Pennsylvania. In that case, Judge Jones made this rather remarkable comment. He said that the school board had showed, quote, breathtaking inanity in the adopting of the policy that he struck down, but the school board in Little Axe was at least as bad as that. The court had issued a preliminary injunction forbidding the school from holding religious meetings until the case was resolved. But in October 1983, the school board went even further. They held a mandatory assembly at the junior high school with a local minister and a traveling evangelist. The evangelist gave his testimony about how God had helped him overcome a disability, and he invited everyone to come to a revival at the local church that night. When this was pointed out to the judge, he was a little pissed off about it. And the school tried to argue that this assembly wasn't forbidden by the injunction because the assembly was totally different from the Sunshine Club. It was different, they said, because it happened during the school day instead of before, and it was mandatory instead of voluntary. Yeah, not the sharpest knives in the drawer. The judge responded to that claim by calling it, quote, so patently absurd that it is unworthy of further comment. But it also proved to the judge that the school really did have the entire purpose of inculcating Christianity in the students. And he said, quote, the district's blatant disregard for the clear import of the court's injunction convinces us that the district's preeminent purpose in permitting these meetings to be held was religious in nature, and that the policy was adopted to conceal that purpose. So they won. The judge ruled in Joanne Bell's favor. The school appealed to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. The appeals court upheld it. The Supreme Court then denied cert, didn't take the case, so the ruling stood. Because Christians are safely in the majority, most of them see no reason, or many of them at least, to worry about the rights of those who are not part of their tribe. But in 2005, a retired Air Force officer who had been stationed in a predominantly Japanese part of Hawaii wrote an article about his experiences there that taught him what it was like to be part of a religious minority. This letter was actually published in a website called the WorldNet Daily, which, if you read my blog, I make fun of every single day. It is one of the worst far-right websites. Somehow they published this letter in 2005. He and his wife attended a local high school football game and were not at all surprised when a man came on the PA and asked everyone to rise for an invocation. They were very surprised to find out that the prayers were not Christian, but were given by a local Buddhist priest. And I want to read you what he wrote as he considered what he should do while those prayers were spoken. Quote, "To continue to stand and observe this prayer would represent a betrayal of our own faith and imply the honoring of a pagan deity that was anathema to our beliefs. To sit would be an act of extreme rudeness and disrespect in the eyes of our Japanese hosts and neighbors, who value above all other things deference and respect in their social interactions. I'm sorry to say that in the confusion of the moment, we chose the easier path and elected to continue to stand in silence so as not to create a scene or ill will among those who were seated nearby. Needless to say, this was our first and last football game. Although many of the students we worked with continued to invite us to the games, we were forced to decline. We knew that if we were to attend, again, we would be forced to abstain from the pregame activity, and not wanting to offend our Asiatic neighbors and colleagues, we simply refrained from attending. When placed in a setting where the majority culture proved hostile to my faith and beliefs, I became paralyzed with indecision and could not act decisively to defend and proclaim my own beliefs. I felt instantly ostracized and viewed myself as a foreigner in my own land. We often advocate the practice of Judeo-Christian rituals in America's public schools by hiding behind the excuse that they are voluntary, and any student who doesn't wish to participate can simply remain seated and silent. Oh, that this were true. But if I, as a mature adult, would be so confounded and uncomfortable when faced with the decision of observing and standing on my own religious principles or running the risk of offending the majority crowd, I can only imagine what thoughts and confusion must run through the head of the typical child or teenager for whom peer acceptance is one of the highest ideals. I would say in love to my Christian brothers and sisters, before you yearn for the imposition of prayer and similar rituals in your public schools, you might consider attending a football game at Wahawea High School. Because unless you're ready to endure the unwilling exposure of yourself and your children to those beliefs and practices that your own faith forswears, you have no right to insist that others sit in silence and complicity while you do the same to them. Now that's a Christian who finally got to walk a mile in the shoes of those who are treated as second-class citizens and are, in the words of Justice O'Connor, told that they are outsiders and not full members of the community. Now, I certainly don't believe that most Christians support these kinds of threats and violence I've talked about. This is a small minority that commits these acts. But what you do hear from Christians all the time is that they just don't understand why we make such a big deal out of things like nativity scenes on public property, or Ten Commandments monuments in schools, or under God and the Pledge of Allegiance. They don't understand it because they live within the comforting confines of the nation's dominant religion and are protected from the concerns of religious minorities and non-believers. They simply can't conceive of the way these things turn the rest of us into strangers in our own country and deprive us of the comforting safety of the cocoon that they are allowed to live in. That's exactly why we need to continue these fights. And one of the most important things we can do is build communities like this one, like KUSOMA, like the Freedom from Religion Foundation, like the Secular Student Alliance. Jessica Ahlquist told me, the first interview that I did with her, she said the very first person, she had no idea there was such a thing as an atheist community. None, didn't know that. The very first person to call her was J.T. Eberhard, or email her, one or the other. First person to contact her, and he was still working for the Secular Student Alliance at the time, and he emailed her and said, "We got your back. There's a whole community of people out here who support you." And she said just knowing that got her through that. And of course, after that, lots of people reached out to her. And she now speaks at conferences like this one, Secular Student Alliance, Center for Inquiry. They all began inviting her to speak. She, of course, spoke at the Reason Rally in front of 15 or 20,000 people. This kind of support is so important to show how these brave young people, that no matter how much their local communities may seem to despise them, there is a community where they are welcome and celebrated. So I want to thank all of you for taking part in communities, for helping build communities like this, because that's the only way we're going to help these people stand up to this kind of abuse that they face. Thank you very much.